Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and can you still hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you all right too.
Okay, great. Right. Okay, here we go. All right, again, hi everyone. As Tim mentioned, my name is Whitney Watson. I am a graduate student in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm going to be talking to you today about my research exploring the dispersal behavior of barred owls at the leading edge of their range expansion. And this image here on this first slide is a photo I took of a barred owl on an old growth redwood tree here in Mendocino County. So I just want to start off by acknowledging the indigenous peoples that served as the original stewards of the land on the Mendocino coast prior to European colonization. And specifically, the work I'm about to share with you takes place primarily on land historically inhabited by various Pomo tribes. So I'm going to start off very broadly and getting into anthropogenic change in the environment that has led to shifts in species geographic ranges across the globe, such as human land use change and global climate change. And while the range of many species has declined due to this change, other species have expanded in range because of changing landscape conditions, such as the elimination of dispersal barriers. And expanding native species can become invasive if they fill open ecological niches and come into contact with naive biological communities when they enter new ecosystems. Then these invasive species can have profound impacts on native species via predation, competition, habitat alteration, introduction of novel pathogens, and hybridization. These novel interactions can lead to substantial declines in populations of native species, as is the case with the red wolf shown here, in response to the range expansion of the coyote into the southeastern US over the last century. And the map of that expansion is also shown here. The red wolf is native to the southeastern US and has suffered declines through hybridization and introgression as a result of the coyote's range expansion. Changes in species interactions, particularly in the case of invasive predators, can lead to trophic cascades that can reorganize biological communities and alter ecosystem function and services. And with these range expansions and the potential deleterious effects on naive ecosystems comes a need to better understand the mechanisms behind these expansions. In animal species, range expansion is largely driven by natal dispersal, or the movement of an individual from its birth site to its breeding location. And this can be seen in the expansion of the European starling's range after its introduction to the US in 1891. This map shows the breeding range of the starling in 1941 to the right of the solid black line, along with observations of juvenile starlings to the west of that line that same year. And since then, starlings have gone on to inhabit the entire continental US. Natal dispersal events are often classified as short distance or long distance, and the long distance dispersal, or the short distance dispersal, is generally thought to be more common, as seen with the dispersal curves here for European bird species. Long distance dispersal has more bearing on spatial spread and colonization rates, and is therefore more consequential in shaping an invasion. It should be noted, however, that long distance dispersal events are inherently difficult to observe and quantify, and therefore may be underestimated in dispersal research. Furthermore, there's no standardized threshold between short distance and long distance dispersal, and the definition of what constitutes long distance dispersal is often tied to its rarity of occurrence. It's particularly important to understand the dispersal behavior of expanding species at the leading edge of their range expansion, as there may be unique evolutionary pressures at play here in comparison to long established populations. And this is also where implementation of management is most critical to slow or prevent further expansion. This brings us to the barred owl, which is a species native to the eastern US that has expanded its range west over the last century, most likely due to human land use change, creating more suitable habitat across the Great Plains. And their original range is shown on the map here in dark purple with their expanded range in the lighter shade. This range expansion has brought barred owls into contact with the federally threatened northern spotted owl, a subspecies of spotted owl which has been imperiled by habitat loss and has been in decline over the past several decades. Barred owls are slightly larger and more aggressive than spotted owls and are able to outcompete them for habitat, as well as threaten them through hybridization and even direct predation. The range of the barred owl now entirely overlaps the range of the northern spotted owl, and barred owl range expansion has been found to be a major contributing factor to the decline of northern spotted owls. And furthermore, barred owls have a broader diet than spotted owls and tend to occupy the landscape at a higher density, which raises the possibility of impacts of their range expansion on other species other than just the spotted owl. We can get some idea of owl diet from examining their pellets, but there's a lot that is missed, as the prey items that appear in their pellets tend to be prey with fur or prey with bones that get trapped in the fur of other prey items. And a colleague of mine at UW-Madison, Nick Krischak, is currently working on sequencing DNA from the stomachs of barred owls in California and has found that they are eating quite a wide variety of prey items. So the figure here shows a breakdown of the barred owl stomach contents by weighted percent of occurrence that Nick has found. It reflects the proportion of total prey found in all the samples that each prey type represents. And this is from a sample of 124 barred owls. And most notably, you can see in this figure that barred owls appear to eat many things that we don't know spotted owls to typically eat, as spotted owls are mostly known to eat small mammals. So the barred owls have been found to be eating reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fish, as well as a wider variety of mammals than spotted owls. And this has implications for conservation of a number of species, particularly for threatened or sensitive species of amphibians, like certain frogs and salamanders, and for other predator species as well, like fishers and hawks that rely on certain prey items, like, for instance, the Douglas squirrel. This data is only for vertebrates, but Nick has also found a high frequency of invertebrates in their stomachs, like Jerusalem crickets and earthworms. And earthworms in particular are something that definitely wouldn't show up in a pellet. That's why this research is so valuable. And this broad diet means that barred owls don't act as a replacement for spotted owls in their ecological niche. And this diagram here from a paper by Holm et al. 2016 outlines some of the potential trophic cascades that the presence of barred owls could be causing in their expanded range, including indirect predatory, behavioral, and ecological impacts on various prey and competing predators and ecosystem processes as well. In fact, through assisting me with my work in this region, another colleague of mine, Danny Hofstadter, has been able to document barred owls eating a variety of prey items through photos, which I'm sharing with you here. This includes a western gray squirrel in the top left, which an adult delivered to a juvenile barred owl, a chipmunk in the bottom left, fledgling Steller's jay in the top right, and a giant salamander in the bottom right, and then a northern alligator lizard in the center photo. Because of the impact barred owls are having on spotted owls and potentially other species, the California Barred Owl Science Team has specifically identified barred owl natal dispersal as a high priority research need for the conservation of the spotted owl and of West Coast forest ecosystems. More information on barred owl natal dispersal can help us to gain a better understanding of the potential for further range expansion in the species, and could help managers to arrest the further spread of barred owls and to optimize management strategies such as removal in areas they already occupy, in terms of knowing how large to make barred owl-free refugia in order to protect native species. To give you some context for what we know of natal dispersal in Strix owls up until this point, there have been radio tagging studies of dispersal in spotted owls, but our knowledge of dispersal in barred owls is limited to just a handful of band recoveries, which tell us a start and an end point of dispersal, but not what happens in between, and they're highly opportunistic. Of a sample of 10 band recoveries of barred owls in their expanded range, the median dispersal distance was 20.5 kilometers. But some band recovery data from barred owls in their eastern native range found multiple instances of owls ending up at least 200 kilometers from their previous recorded location. And in terms of some of the spotted owl dispersal studies that have been done, a study by Forsman et al. In 2002 found that northern spotted owl dispersal in Oregon and Washington was pretty skewed towards what they classified as shorter distances, with only 8.7% of the juveniles in their study dispersing farther than 50 kilometers from their natal territories. And in terms of survival, a study on Mexican spotted owls in Arizona found that 20 to 28% of juvenile spotted owls survived the first year, though other studies have kind of had a range of outcomes. One study found that found a mortality rate of around 50%, but there was a high level of uncertainty there. And then another study on northern spotted owls had 100% mortality in their sample, but it was a small sample size. So in my study, I set out to use satellite GPS technology in the characterization of barred owl dispersal. And this technology allows for the entirely remote tracking of tagged individuals. So there's no need for any on-the-ground tracking to collect location data. And my specific aims were to characterize the timing and distance of dispersal, characterize habitat use of dispersing juveniles, including identifying potential dispersal corridors and barriers, and to estimate the survival rates of juveniles in their first year and assess mortality factors during dispersal whenever possible. I conducted my work in the Coastal Redwood Region of California at the southern edge of the barred owl's current range on the West Coast. And specifically, I worked in Mendocino and a little bit in Sonoma counties on a mixed ownership landscape, which included Jackson Demonstration State Forest, California State Parks, as well as properties owned by the Conservation Fund, Redwood Forest Foundation, Inc., and Mendocino Redwood Company. And much of this landscape has been heavily logged, and it primarily consists of second growth redwood forests with patches of old growth mixed in. So I worked with a team of researchers to capture and track barred owls in the spring and summer of 2020 and 2021. We primarily used a mistnet and owl decoy setup shown here to capture the adult owls in the spring. And we set up nets in known barred owl territories and broadcasted barred owl calls to draw in owl pairs and compel them to swoop at the nets. This method does not allow one to target an individual owl specifically, so we just tagged whichever member of the pair we were able to capture first. And we also found success using a pan trap to capture some of the adults, shown here. Once we captured the adults, we attached GPS tags to them. And these tags, these are not the satellite GPS tags. These are VHF telemetry capable tags, and also collect GPS data on board and allow for the remote download of that data. So during the following months after capturing and tagging the adults, we tracked them and downloaded GPS data from them and used the GPS data along with field observations to determine which ones were nesting. So the map here shows an example of the data we collected from 5 of the owls in 2020, all of which in this case were female. And we found that nesting females achieved fewer fixes than non-nesting females due to their time spent in a nest often blocked from satellites. And the fixes they achieved were also much more tightly clustered. So we were able to determine nesting status fairly readily from the females that we had tagged. And we used these tight point clusters of females we suspected to be nesting to locate and confirm nests through telemetry and through behavioral observations. And there were cases where we had adult males tagged rather than females. And in those cases, the GPS data wasn't as telling. So we had to rely more heavily on the telemetry and behavioral observations in the field to locate the nests. Once we located the nests, we monitored the progress of those nests and subsequently the development of the juveniles once they fledged. And seen here is a photo of a nestling barred owl peeking out of its nest cavity just prior to fledging. We began capturing and tagging juveniles in July when juveniles were sufficiently developed. And for this, we used snare pull, hand grab, and pan trap methods, as the juveniles are highly food motivated at this stage. And to the juveniles, we attached the satellite GPS tags, which collect GPS data on board and then transmit the data via satellite. And they are expected to last up to 1.5 years with the programming that I've given them, taking a fix every 5 days. And once they collect GPS fixes on board, and once they've collected 3 successful fixes, they transmit the data to a web portal through the Argos satellite system, which I can then access and download the data from. So I'm going to walk through some of my preliminary findings for the juveniles we tagged in 2020 and 2021. And first off, I want to go through some of the definitions and metrics I used in describing dispersal in my research. So first off, I consider juveniles to have begun dispersal once they traveled beyond the 95% fixed kernel home range of their GPS tagged parents and did not return at a later date. And this home range is shown here in orange, basically just when they left the area that their parents had occupied based on the GPS data from the parents. And in the example here, I considered the point that I've circled in red to be the first post-dispersal point of this individual. So to find the date of dispersal initiation for that juvenile, I found a date associated with that point. And when no parental GPS data was available, on the other hand, or if the data was insufficient, I considered juveniles to have begun dispersal once they left a 2-kilometer buffer around the capture location. And this buffer estimate was based on home range data of breeding GPS tagged adult barred owls. So once I had sufficient dispersal data, I calculated distance measurements from the GPS data, including maximum dispersal distance, which is the farthest distance a juvenile traveled from the natal territory during dispersal, indicated by the red line here, as well as final dispersal distance, which is the distance between the capture location and the final or most recent location of a juvenile. And keep in mind that because I'm still collecting data from these juveniles, the quote unquote final dispersal distance typically refers to the distance between the capture location and the most recent GPS point I've received from that individual, not necessarily its final location, because it could move to a different place still. And I also looked at the distance between consecutive fixes indicated here, which in this case were collected every 5 days. So I'm going to start off by sharing my findings from the juveniles we tagged back in 2020. We were able to tag 12 adult barred owls that year in the spring, all in unique territories. Those territories are shown here on the map. The orange and green shapes indicate the home ranges of the females and males based on their GPS data. And we located 7 nests in those 12 territories. Once we tracked nest and fledgling development in those territories, we were able to capture and tag 8 juvenile barred owls in July and August of that year, just prior to them beginning to disperse. And they began dispersing between August 4th and September 23rd of that year, with all but one leaving their natal territory in August. The map here shows the dispersal paths of those 8 owls in the year past dispersal initiation. So as of last month, we've confirmed 4 mortalities out of those 8 individuals, and 2 juveniles have ceased to transmit GPS locations, indicating either mortality or equipment failure. The table here shows the survival estimates for various time periods past dispersal initiation. And the survival rate here is based on a midpoint of dispersal dates. The 2 owls died in the first month, indicated by the red and green circles, one from a vehicle collision and another of unknown causes, but presumably starvation because we saw no signs of predation. And a 3rd owl failed to transmit any data past September of that year, possibly due to equipment failure, but it's more likely that this owl just perished in a place without a communication path to satellites. So this gives us a survival rate of 0.63 to 0.75 for the first 3 months. And then in the following 3 months, another 2 juveniles perished, giving us a 6-month survival rate of 0.38 and 0.5. And in these cases, we were unable to ascertain the cause of death due to the time that had passed between the mortality event and when we were able to locate the corpses in the field. There were signs of disturbance, but we were unable to distinguish between predation and scavenging post-mortem. And another owl failed to transmit any points past April of this year, leading to a second unknown fate and a 12-month survival rate as of this September between 0.25 and 0.5. And then 2 of the 8 juveniles survived 1 year past dispersal initiation, and I continue to receive GPS points from them to this day. Moving on to dispersal distances from those juveniles, the median maximum dispersal distance was 78.9 kilometers, and the maximum distance any of the juveniles traveled from its natal territory is 146.5 kilometers or 91 miles. Distance which I've indicated on the map. And for the measure of dispersal distance, I've included only individuals that survived the first month post-dispersal, since individuals that died early on likely did not have an opportunity to make it to a location where they would have settled. All juveniles, aside from the 2 that died during the first month, traveled at least 50 kilometers from their natal territory. The median final dispersal distance of all the juveniles tagged in 2020 that survived the first month was 50.4 kilometers, and the farthest the juvenile was last located from its natal territory was 88.6 kilometers, and that's one of the juveniles that is still active. Some other things to note are that several individuals traveled around 50 kilometers in a single 5-day period, some instances of which I've highlighted here, and also that 66.7% of the juveniles surviving past the first month traveled farther than 50 kilometers, indicating that quote unquote long distance dispersal seems to be common in this species. Most of the time, the longer ranging movements occurred in the first couple of months after dispersal initiation, with the owls exhibiting shorter movements after that. But the individual in purple on the map here stayed within a few kilometers of its natal territory until March of this year, when it began to make larger movements to a new location. In fact, the 2 owls that are still alive 1 year post-dispersal have had almost opposite strategies. The purple individual, as I said, stayed close by its natal territory through the winter and then moved to where it is now, whereas the blue individual moved to its current location in October of 2020 and hasn't left that general area since. And now both have been settled in their current areas since the spring of this year. So moving on to the results from the juveniles we tagged in this year. We tagged 27 adults this spring in 25 unique territories, including 10 of the same territories from 2020. And the map here again shows the 95% kernel density estimate home ranges of the tagged adults. And there were 2 territories in which we tagged both the male and the female. Some of the home ranges may appear very small, but this is because that data came from nesting females, and those females stayed in a very tight range during the breeding season, and then we were unable to achieve a data download later on in the season once they began moving around more. Of those 25 territories, we found that 21 of them were nesting, and 20 of those nests were successful. And in fact, 7 of those nesting pairs had triplets, so I'd say those ones were very successful. In 13 of those territories with the successful nests, and 1 additional territory where we had not tagged an adult, we were able to capture and attach satellite GPS tags to 23 juveniles in July of this year. So we nearly quadrupled our sample size from the previous year. This year, dispersal initiation began on August 4th, once again, with the majority of juveniles leaving their natal territory closer to mid-August, and the last leaving as of September 10th. 1 owl still hadn't left its natal territory as of September 8th, when I last received data from that tag. So I'm unsure if that individual survived to the point of dispersal, and I'm leaving it out of any dispersal distance analyses accordingly. I've received data from 11 of the 23 juveniles 2 months past the median date of dispersal initiation, and this map shows their movement paths. The other juveniles have not moved very far, so their movement's not easily distinguishable at the scale of this map anyway, so I've excluded them. 9 of the juveniles haven't transmitted any points since early October or before, indicating potential mortality in a spot without access to satellites. But it's possible that I could still receive points from some of these individuals in the future, just based on how the tags work. 2 of the juveniles have been confirmed deceased, and a third is almost certainly dead as well, based upon its transmission of several consecutive points in the exact same location, which doesn't happen with owls that are alive and active. The only other possibility is that the tag was dropped by the owl, but I've yet to see this happen in my study. So the survival of between 11 and 19 out of 23 juveniles gives us a 2-month survival rate of between 0.48 and 0.83, which is unfortunately quite a large range. As far as the distances that these owls have dispersed, again, I'm focusing only on the owls that made it past the first month, and the median maximum dispersal distance of those owls is 60.7 kilometers. The longest distance traveled by an individual from its natal territory for this group is 121 kilometers or 75 miles. So far, none of the owls this year have exceeded the 146 kilometers traveled by one of the 2020 juveniles. The median final dispersal distance of the 2021 juveniles is 56.1 kilometers, and the maximum of that is 121.2 kilometers. And the longest distance moved in a single 5-day period of these juveniles is 58.9 kilometers, which I've highlighted here on the map. And this is greater than what any of the 2020 juveniles moved in a single 5-day period. And once again, a large portion of the juveniles have traveled more than 50 kilometers, even in this short window of time that I've been receiving data from them. Something to note is that the landscape is not homogeneous across the area the owls have been using as they disperse. Owl movements have spanned 3 different ecoregions: the Northern California coastal forests, shown here in teal, the Klamath Siskiyou forest in green, and the California interior chaparral and woodlands in beige. And 1 juvenile even made it to the edge of the Central Valley grasslands ecoregion recently, only to turn around immediately and head back to a more forested landscape. This map shows the movements of all of the juveniles that we tagged from both years, along with the fates of the 2020 juveniles. I've put them all in the same color just for simplicity's sake. And several of the juveniles have spent a significant amount of time in the chaparral and woodlands ecoregion in beige, which is quite a contrast to the coniferous forest where we captured the owls. Here is an image of what that ecoregion can look like. It's often dominated by oaks and is a much more open landscape than the coniferous forest of the Klamath Siskiyou region and the coastal forests. And this is not a region where spotted owls are commonly found. In fact, based on northern spotted owl detections from the California Natural Diversity Database, there have been relatively few spotted owl observations in this region. It's important to consider, however, that these spotted owl detections largely represent territorial owls and aren't necessarily indicative of areas that may be used by juvenile spotted owls during dispersal. And though juvenile barred owls have spent time in this region, the individuals that we tagged in 2020 eventually moved back toward the Klamath-Siskiyou forest ecoregion. It's also worth noting that many of the juveniles have ended up in this area bordering the two ecoregions. Multiple 2020 juveniles have perished here, and one persists here to this day. It could just be that there aren't as many other barred owls in that region to compete with, but I'll be examining this habitat use much more in depth once I've collected sufficient data from the juveniles from 2021. Another aspect I'll be looking at when it comes to habitat use is the impact of wildfires on barred owl dispersal. In September of 2020, while I'd already begun collecting data on juvenile dispersal that year, the August complex fire burned over 400,000 hectares of forest in Mendocino National Forest and surrounding lands to the east of my study area. And this fire occurred just to the north of the 2018 Mendocino complex fire, which itself burned nearly 200,000 hectares. And these fire footprints are indicated on the map here in shades of red. So until recently, the tagged juvenile barred owls hadn't occupied or moved through this wall of burned forest, aside from one which moved north through the area at the time the fire was still spreading. And in many cases, the owls have reached the fire footprint only to turn right around. Now, though, one owl has moved through the fire footprint into the Central Valley and back, indicating that the fire footprint does not appear to be a dispersal barrier. But I will be incorporating burn severity into my habitat analysis using data from the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity database to assess how habitat selection during dispersal is impacted by forest burn recency and severity. So to sum up my findings thus far, juvenile barred owls appear to trend toward long-ranging dispersal as dispersal distances of greater than 50 kilometers were observed at high rates. This means that recolonization of areas into areas of removal can occur from barred owls originating quite far away, which could explain the rapid recolonization that has been witnessed in barred owl removal areas. And this means that large buffer zones may be needed around barred owl-free refugia in order to prevent barred owl recolonization. Another of my findings is that barred owl first-year survival rates seem consistent with those found in spotted owl studies, though there's a high level of uncertainty with so many unknown fates. And lastly, barred owls may be using a wider variety of habitat types than spotted owls, as demonstrated by their frequent presence in the chaparral and woodland ecoregion during dispersal. So as far as the next steps for my research, I will continue to monitor the tagged juveniles from 2020 and 2021, as long as those tags continue to transmit data. And so far, based on the fact that 2 of the tags from 2020 are still transmitting data, as of 2 weeks ago, I know that the tags have the capacity to last at least 15 months past deployment. With the dispersal data from both years, I plan to further characterize trends in dispersal timing and distance, use a use versus availability framework to look for preferences in habitat during dispersal, including examining potential corridors for and barriers to dispersal, for example, severe fire footprints or riparian areas. And I also plan to conduct a more robust survival analysis of dispersing juveniles using known fate models. And ideally, the information to be gained on barred owl dispersal from this study will help us to better understand the means of their range expansion and to implement more efficient and effective management practices. And hopefully we can also gain a better understanding of the mechanisms behind species range expansions more broadly. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening tonight. I want to also give a shout out to the many people, agencies, and organizations that have made this research possible. in particular the field technicians without whom I would not have this data. And I will happily take any questions.
All right. If I can get my stuff together here. Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. We did get some several questions during the talk, so I'll try to run down through those and see how we do. So the first, we have a couple of questions from Laura Baker. How does the leading southern dispersing owl differ? This was coming on a specific slide, so hopefully you can kind of figure out which one she's talking about. The leading southern dispersing owl differ in terms of its movements from other juveniles or habitat types. So you had one owl that kind of took off to the south, and it's a little tough, I know, to talk. You can't draw conclusions from an individual, but maybe talk a little bit about how that particular movement differed from the other birds, or whether it did.
Is that referring to the one owl that moved pretty far to the south?
I think so. I think that's what she meant.
Okay. I don't know how it's differing in terms of its movements. It was definitely exhibiting long-ranging movements, but it was occupying a kind of a different type of habitat from many of the other ones that stayed closer to the coniferous forest, closer to the coast.
Yeah, now here's a good question that I've had before. In comparing northern spotted owls and barred owl detections, does the fact that barred owls tend to suppress the calls of northern spotted owls alter the accuracy of northern spotted owl data? So this is the same question I've asked a couple of different people about. There was some evidence, I know from several years ago, that the presence of barred owls in a spotted owl territory seems to inhibit the vocalization by the spotted owls, and they don't respond to playback when you try to survey them, which of course was the survey method. I posed this question to Jack Dumbacher when we interviewed him on the Ecology Hour a few months ago, and apparently they have developed several alternative methods of surveying spotted owls. Can you talk a little bit about that, or is that outside your area of research?
That's a little outside the realm of my research. I don't have specific knowledge to speak to that, but I'm sure there are plenty of other people that do. I haven't looked into that specifically.
Yeah, we had an Ecology Hour interview on KZYX a few months ago, and by the way, just a plug for that, the website for that program is called ecologyhour.wordpress.com, and I now have links to all of the interviews are all available as podcasts now, so you can go to that website and find those interviews and listen to anything from 2021. And the one from Jack Dumbacher was specifically about the barred owl, kind of the overview of the whole invasion story. But that was a question that I specifically asked him, and he had a pretty good answer to it. There have been some studies. In fact, he went into quite a bit of detail about the arduous nature of some of the research done to try to find out what was going on, where researchers are clambering around in the coastal forests in extremely difficult terrain. But the bottom line was he was pretty confident they had ways to survey that would find spotted owls if they were in fact present, even though they don't necessarily respond to the vocalization playback like they used to.
Mm-hmm. I know I've heard anecdotes of spotted owls that, at least in the Sierra Nevada, that hadn't been seen or heard from for several years, and barred owls had occupied their historic territories, and then once those barred owls were removed as part of an experimental study, some of the spotted owls that had been MIA for several years suddenly appeared again. So they had been there just kind of hiding out and staying quiet, probably off in a slightly different territory than they occupied historically.
Yeah, that was something that happened in that very first experimental barred owl, when they were first experimenting with shooting them to see what would happen. And it immediately cast doubt on the entire spotted owl survey data, because there was an owl that had been missing for, I think it was 5 years, an adult female. And it was the late Lowell Diller, I think, doing that work. And he shot the barred owls that had taken over the territory where this adult female spotted owl had formerly been seen regularly. And then the very next season went out to survey, and there she was sitting on a branch waiting for him. So they had to, I think there was quite a lot of effort put into finding another way to survey for spotted owls once the barred owl upsets the whole normal way of doing things. So this is another question I think you will know the answer to, from Diane. There have been some proposals of forest management to assist the spotted and deter the barred owls. Is that being pursued? And forest management is a pretty generalized term. Can you talk a little bit about what you know is being worked on in terms of forest management? Sort of for the balance.
Yeah, so a major avenue that's being pursued is barred owl removal, and that's currently in experimental phases right now. But I know that's a big method that people are looking towards. Other than that, I think people are looking for potential ways to manage a forest to kind of promote spotted owl occupancy and deter barred owls. But so far, I don't believe anyone has really found any solid evidence of any kind of habitat or conditions that spotted owls will prefer that barred owls won't, because barred owls kind of seem to be okay with everything.
Yeah, which is a real problem. By coincidence, I just did an interview earlier today with another scientist studying invasions in general. We were talking about a completely different ecosystem, but the common theme with a lot of these invasive species is removal frequently doesn't really do much. You can go in and eradicate them in some cases from the area they've invaded, and then you turn around and go home and they come right back because you didn't really change the conditions that led to the invasion in the first place. And I think that's going to be a real concern with the owls. I am intrigued, though, that you mentioned there is some research into whether or not there's a type of forest that can be whether or not you can manage a forest in such a way as to favor spotted owls. It sounds like so far no luck with that.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. And I mean, that's a reason that I want to look into potential dispersal corridors in my study to see if there's some type of habitat that these owls use to disperse, where it would be possible to somehow block off that dispersal.
Yeah, interesting. So here's another question that I think you can answer pretty well, and that will help us understand what's going on. How large are barred owl territories compared to spotted owl? And then I can't quite make out how close are they in range.
So they definitely tend to be smaller than spotted owl territories, which is how they come to occupy landscapes at a higher density. And they can be pretty close. If you caught from some of the maps that I showed, some of the some of the home ranges were almost overlapping. They were so close. And, you know, we found, I don't know, in the teens of territories just in Jackson State Forest itself. So they can be very close to one another. That's something that I would like to look at with the adult data that I've collected, is kind of really analyzing how close those territories can actually be. And there's some research by Dave Weens up in Oregon looking at competitive interactions between spotted owls and barred owls, and I think he may have gone into that a bit in his paper. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the number I remember is in general, it seems like you can fit about 4 barred owl pairs into the territory that would normally be occupied by 1 pair of spotted owls. They're that much more efficient at getting resources out of the habitat. The basic problem here is that they are extremely fit for the environment, much more so than the spotted owl, and that makes it really difficult to turn back the tide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here's a good question. Do we know the total population of the barred owl? And this presumably would mean the population within the western expansion area, where they overlap with the spotted owl range. What do we know what the population of barred owls in that range is today?
In their entire expanded range in the western U.S.
Well, maybe she just means in Mendocino County, because it also asked, and what percentage of them were you able to tag? So do you have an estimate of barred owl population, say in Mendocino?
I really don't know. To my knowledge, no one is comprehensively studying them, and in fact, most barred owl detections just come opportunistically from spotted owl surveys. So no one really knows how many there are. There's so much private land in Mendocino County that it's hard to get a good estimate. There aren't really comprehensive surveys being done like there are in some places in like the national forest and things like that. So I really don't know what percentage of the barred owls we tagged. It seemed like everywhere we went there were more barred owls, so I would guess that they're kind of just everywhere across the county, but yeah, it's hard to say. I wish I had more data on that.
It's a little bit of a surprise to me that no one is surveying for them, since they've been identified as the number 1 threat to the spotted owl right now. The conventional story, at least, is that the Northwest Forest Management Plan didn't have a chance because the barred owl showed up just as it was being implemented. So we can't even tell whether changes in forest practices would have helped the spotted owl recover or not. It's been declining. The spotted owl population's been declining at about 4% a year. And a lot of that is attributed to the barred owl competition. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little surprised that there hasn't been an effort to do a census and just find out what the numbers are.
Yeah, at least not in this area. Some areas where they do spotted owl demography work, I believe they're actually surveying for barred owls in some cases, but it's mostly in relation with removal studies, as in providing a control for the removal study.
Yeah. So the next question gets directly to that. Says, thanks for the great presentation. Many recommend a removal program for barred owls. Given that forest management boundaries are open, these aren't closed systems, how does such a significant natal dispersal affect the chances of success? for a barred owl removal program. It seems there would just be a continuous pressure of juvenile barred owls from adjacent and even distant locations.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And that seems to be what people are seeing, particularly, for instance, I know on the Hoopa tribe land up north in Humboldt County, they remove barred owls and they just keep getting more and more subadults every year coming in. And yeah, what I'm finding is that they can move great distances. So it's hard to say. The removal has definitely been more successful, I think, in the Sierra Nevada, where there was much less of a barred owl presence when they started it. So yeah, they seem to have taken over this entire coastal area already. So I don't know what that means for the success of removal programs.
Yeah, I think we could spend another hour talking about that. Here's a short one. How many years do barred owls take to reach maturity?
It's thought around 3 years. Barred owls are considered in their first year, they're considered subadult 1, and then in their second year, subadult 2. So they can breed when I think there are instances of them breeding when they're just 1 year old, but it's not common. But they can breed when they're 2 and 3. So I think there's kind of differing takes on that, but I would say about 3, and that's when they exhibit adult plumage, is when they're 3 years old typically.
And are they still moving around at that point? So do they continue their sort of peregrinations for the first 2 years, or is that, I guess that's that's one of the questions you're probably attempting to answer with this very study, huh?
Yeah, that's something that I'm hoping to find a little bit more out about, providing that the tags last long enough to tell me that. But I believe it's been found in spotted owls that they'll kind of they might settle down in a spot in the first year, and then potentially the next year move again. So I believe there's definitely a possibility for them to keep looking around for more opportune territory. And I know from some of the adults that we have tagged, I know like there was one territory where we tagged I think the female, or one of them was a subadult, and then the next year there was a new owl in that another subadult that had replaced the previous one. So that seems to indicate that they were still kind of on the move, still figuring out where they were going to settle.
Have you been able to determine whether juvenile barred owls are using particular open corridors like the PG&E right of way or roads to invade new territories?
I haven't really looked at, I haven't actually been able to fully dive into my habitat analysis yet. I'm waiting until I have data from both years. So I haven't found anything along those lines, but they tend to like riparian areas, wet bottomland areas. So I would guess, if anything, they might be using rivers as corridors, possibly roads as well. I know owls like to hunt along roads because they're able to see a lot of prey on the edge there. So possibly.
It would require pretty fine-grained data.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting a location report, I think, if I heard you correctly, once every 5 days.
Yep. Right. Yeah. So what I'm finding out is on a pretty coarse scale. Yeah. I know one of the individuals did get hit by a car, so that one was along a road, presumably.
And if I think I saw that on your slide, it looked like it was right out here on, maybe on Highway 1. It was right on the coast, wasn't it?
That was actually one that just perished probably because of starvation. The one that got hit by a car was actually right outside of Cloverdale.
Oh. The spotted owls used to get hit a lot because for the same reason, they would come down right on the road to grab rodents that were running across the road or whatever, and they were completely unafraid of automobiles. So it was a real problem on Highway 128. And now I don't know if there's any spotted owls left on Highway 128. The barred owl moved in there 10 or 15 years
Not many. There are quite a few barred owls. A bunch of the adults that we tagged were along that route. I mean, we pretty much filled up that whole forested corridor there with barred owl territory. I mean, I'm aware of the barred owl pairs, and they kind of fill up the land on that strip. So there isn't a whole lot of room left for spotted owls there. And I haven't heard any.
The barred owl territories adjoin pretty much.
Yeah, for the most part. There's maybe a few gaps, but that might just be in areas that also don't have ideal habitat. But yeah, I know there are at least 5 pairs of barred owls along that stretch, and possibly more.
So this is circling back to something we were talking about earlier, and I think I think we got an answer on this, but I'll just repeat it. The question from Linwood: are there any plans to develop protocols for barred owl surveys?
Not that I'm aware of. I know some. Well, so for instance, when I worked on the Willow Creek demography study, and they had their own protocol in place for barred owl surveys, but that was in relation to that being a control study for the Hooper removal study. So I'm not aware of anything in this region being developed. No.
Yeah, that leads me to a question. Are there any plans for barred owl removal projects in Mendocino County?
I believe there is some planning in the works for that. Yeah.
Interesting. All right.
It's tough though because of the mixed ownership landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think each of the different landowners that you described is going to have a different management objective.
Yep, exactly.
And they'll have a different attitude about whether they really want spotted owls on their property or not. If there are no further questions, that's all the ones I got by chat. And so thanks again, Whitney. That was informative, and it was really great to see that this research is being done right here in our county. And so that filled in a lot of information for us on what's going on in the forests here.
Great. Well, happy to help. Happy to be here and fill you guys in.
Yeah, thanks. It was very informative, and I think people got a lot out of it. I only wish that we could have done it in person. It would have been great to have had you in the hall with us.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm in Wisconsin right now for school, so it would have been hard for me to be there in person.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it would have. On the other hand, I'll bet you the weather's better here than it is in Wisconsin right now.
Yep, most likely. It generally is.
All right, well, that's great. Thank you very much. And I think that pretty much does it for tonight's presentation. Nikki did hit the record button, so we will have this available as a video on our YouTube channel. If you didn't know about that, there is a Mendocino Coast Audubon YouTube channel, and we've been trying to upload our monthly presentations, as well as some birding tutorials that David and I have put together. So go look that up, and we'll get tonight's presentation up there as soon as we can. It'll be a few days probably before we get that done though. So thanks everyone for joining us. Another great night, and we'll stay in touch, and hopefully we will all see you again soon.